Hey, MBA hopefuls. We're on the air with MBA Waves, your weekly vidcast talking all things business and education, streaming live every Tuesday on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. We bring you tons of tips to help you get into top-ranked MBA programs and get you up close and personal with many of these business schools that we host on the show, where you can get all of your questions answered. And if you like this week's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And today on episode 110, we're talking with John Vorhaus, our friend and colleague, who's a partner at Max Associates. And so I've known John for a while. He's an incredibly talented, enthusiastic, artistic, and creative guy. So we're so excited to have you, John. Welcome. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. And also a warm welcome to our co-hosts. How's everyone doing today?
Hey, Bara.
Amazing.
Doing good.
Oh, good. I like amazing. So I'm super excited about this episode because it's not really in my wheelhouse to talk about writing, even though I'm published. I don't do the things that all of you guys do. And I learned so much from all of you. So the way that you help your students and the way that you show up as insightful and thoughtful and help them to be their best selves. So I'd love to really hear from any of you what some of the biggest challenges are when it comes to putting pen to the paper.
Getting started. Just starting. It's so hard sometimes, like you get that kind of writer's block, I guess you could call it. But I find if you just force yourself to go, it starts flowing at some point. It might be garbage at first, but then you get in a kind of groove and you think of something. What about you?
In my personal, sorry,
John. Go ahead, John.
In my personal writing, I'm always afraid of the face of the wave. That's where the words end and the blank page begins, because there's always the sense of, wow, I know what needs to come next, but I don't know if I can write it. I always feel much more comfortable when I finished the first draft of anything, even if it's a really rough or awful draft. It's kind of awful by design a lot of times. But then from that point forward, I'm not really writing. I'm rewriting and editing. And I find that for my brain and my psychology, I'm more comfortable rewriting and editing than originating content.
Interesting. John, since we have you in the spotlight now, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Wow. Okay, well, there went that hour. I come to you today as a partner at Max Associates, educational consulting with a focus on top MBA programs, but I wear a lot of other hats. I've spent the last 3.5 decades traveling around the world, teaching and training writers, mostly in the areas of television and film, making television shows in such faraway lands as Nicaragua and Romania. I kind of have a fondness for being in places I've never been before. So I've let my career take me all around the world. I've published a couple of dozen books, including many books on writing. The top book in my back catalog is called The Comic Toolbox: How to Be Funny Even If You're Not. And my most recent book is kind of a companion to that. It's called The Book of Practice: How to Do Better What You Want to Do Well. I'm always interested in breaking down writing process and creative process into simple tools and strategies that everybody can use to overcome fear blocks, procrastination, stuff like that. I also happen to be a striking writer at this moment because I'm a proud member of the Writers Guild of America. So I'm on strike. I've been out walking the picket line, and I'm excited to see union power muscle being flexed in this critical time.
I'm just a big fan of Fran Drescher.
Well, there you go.
She's the SAG president, is it now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the fact that SAG went out the fact that SAG and Writers Guild are both out at the same time gives both unions more leverage than either has on their own. That's for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, the amount of writing that you've done is it's quite astounding, John. It's really, you've done so many different genres as well, not just writing about writing.
Yep, I've written 7 novels and weirdly 10 books on poker. But I think that the experience of writing poker is illustrative for people who are listening today, because what I was doing was pursuing an opportunity that existed without fear of failure. The poker market got hot. I had some interest in poker, and I found my place in the industry and really exploited the opportunity to do a lot of work in that area. I always say that as a poker player, I'm a pretty good writer, but mostly I was always more interested in writing about poker than playing poker. But the point is that everybody who's watching this podcast probably thinking along the same lines, in the sense that there's this thing that I want to do, but I'm not sure I can pull it off. It looks like a long shot, and I fear failure every step of the way. When I'm dealing with clients and people in all of my practices, that's one of the things that I focus on, helping them understand what their expectations are for the task at hand, and how those expectations might be set in such a way as to be not particularly helpful, and they can be reset to be much more helpful. I did it myself just before this podcast started. I always tell people, when you're going into a space where you're not feeling entirely comfortable, reset your expectation from, crush it and make everybody love me, to the much simpler and more humble, do your best and have fun. Because I figure no matter what I'm doing, whether I'm writing an essay, editing an essay, being on a podcast like this, even walking the picket line, I'll do it much better if I set my goal simply as do your best and have fun. So if you're taking notes out there, kids, that's a good one to take.
I just love that, because I was going to say one of the biggest challenges that my clients have is the fear of the crappy first draft. They think that the first draft has to be perfect, like it has to be 400 words if it's supposed to be 400 words. And also, it has to sound like what the other person wanted to hear. So when you start from that space, you just don't know what to write. And I think that holds somebody back, like saying that, is it impressive enough always? Yeah. So I love, yeah, they had to have fun.
What you're talking about, Krithika, is a class of thought that we call untested assumptions or unchallenged assumptions. And you mentioned a bunch of them there, but let's just look at one or two of them. One assumption is it has to read well. It has to be pretty and polished prose. The writing itself needs to be impressive. But you guys know, as I know, that the business schools are much more interested in authenticity than polish. So actually, this untested assumption, must be polished, can find itself working at cross purposes to a much more valid goal, which is be authentic, be your true self. And another assumption is right there is, if it's 400 words in the final draft, I got to get it down to 400 words in the first draft. Around here, we have an expression, write it long and write it wrong. And that gives you the freedom to let the content go where it wants to go without worrying about getting it down to the final word count. And then the write it wrong part, that just gives you the freedom to try anything with the clear understanding that the first draft is a draft admissions is never ever going to see anyway. So it really doesn't matter.
Nice. I'm still stuck on the idea of writing 10 books about poker. That's nearly one for like every card, basically. It's amazing.
One for a card in the deck. That's a good point.
Right? You have to do a jack, queen, and king, and you're done. But when it comes back to MBA essays, there's some absolute no's. What are your favorites?
Here's a little one that's deceptively hard to pull off. No use of the words we, us, or our in any context for any reason. We writing, first person plural writing, is problematic because admissions never really knows who you're talking about when you say we. Are you talking about yourself and your team, the company, your country, the world? It's indeterminate. But we writing is seductive because it addresses two fears that people commonly have. One fear is, I fear to take credit for other people's work, and therefore I take pains to distribute the credit all around by use of the word we. And the other fear is, I fear to appear arrogant by using I, giving the impression that it's all about me and not about anybody else. I seem not to be humble. There's also the fear of having to take responsibility. This is why politicians frequently hide behind the we. If you ask a politician a question and the politician says, we will look into that, they're really saying, I will look into that, but they're not willing to claim complete ownership of that. Now, we know, you and I, that a successful application demonstrates that the candidate has taken complete ownership of his or her or their story. So even the small change of removing we and I and changing it to I and me It's a very strong, positive way of telegraphing complete ownership over the writer's story. That's why it's a mandate for my clients that those words must never be used. But it's also why I find myself editing them out in late stages, because it's a hard thing for people to remember and sign on to and get used to and execute.
Makes sense. Absolutely.
Well, I learned something new. That's super interesting. I have noticed that politicians always say we, right? Like that's pretty common. I see that all the time.
Distributing the blame, right?
Yeah.
It is distributing the blame. It's ducking responsibility.
I mean, I think politicians
Now,
also, don't they use the royal third person, like, well, Bill Clinton wouldn't make that mistake, right? They do that thing also, I think.
now I have to laugh, because if a client came to me and said, I want to write my Harvard essay in the third person, like literally take that tone. Joe Slobotnik woke up one day and found himself face down on the kitchen floor. I would be so excited by that. I'm not sure about the face down on the kitchen floor part, but a candidate who says, my approach to this is to describe myself in the third person, I'd want to make sure that it wasn't a trick or a gimmick. I would look to see if it was rooted in the candidate's own, I'm going to use a phrase here that I love, sense of whimsy, because it is a whimsical approach. And for a candidate who says, I'm going to own that quality of my personality by coming out of left field with this essay, that's the sort of thing that when I find myself surprised and delighted by a client's approach, I really get behind that. I'm quite in favor of it. Clients will often get blocked. Go ahead.
No, I'm just thinking about how that would play out, right? Like, because imagine being on the reading side of the essay, and it's like, Eric Lucrezia woke up and decided to do this, This could really come off as some arrogant MF, you know what I mean? Like, well, and how would you counterbalance that in other areas of your applications if they understood that it's tongue in cheek, maybe?
I mean, that would be the challenge, but
right.
Again,
like you're on the
writing,
joke,
if the writing is authentic and the intention is to self-reveal, those things are apparent in the writing. You don't need to signpost them. In other words, and I see this a lot in other parts of my practice, you have a writer who wants to take an approach because they think it's an approach that will be pleasing to admissions. They're trying to sell themselves to admissions. A different candidate can take the exact same approach, but the motivation is, this is an authentic expression of who I am. This tells the truth of my experience. I put it to you that a savvy reader, you, us, me, admissions, we can look at that content and know the difference between a sales job and authentic expression. I don't believe it can be hidden. So I would, if it looked like the candidate was doing it just to be clever, I would know it and I would stop them. But if it looked like the candidate was doing it because it was an authentic expression of self, I would also know it and I would nurture that.
It has to be a spectacular piece of writing if they have to pull it off in third person.
You know what? I've never seen it. I've never thought about it, but I don't think it needs to be that spectacular. Let's boil it down to cases, and let's focus on an essay that's important to a lot of people. The Harvard, what else would you like us to know about you? In my understanding and my practice, I see a lot of candidates who try to solve this problem from the outside in. They think, what looks like the right answer to Harvard? What will be pleasing to my imagined understanding of the reader? First of all, they don't really know how the reader will react, but mostly they're trying to solve the problem incorrectly because they're trying to answer the question, what will work best for HBS? What will work best for the reader? A more authentic and ultimately successful approach is to look inside and say, what is authentic to me? What is true about my experience? In other words, instead of writing for the audience of HBS, I encourage my candidates to write for themselves as if they were themselves the audience of their own work. This takes them outside of the need to sell and helps them understand that the job is not to sell themselves to the schools, but just to reveal themselves and their authentic aspirations as plainly and honestly as possible. The consequence of this is that you can have an essay that is beautifully structured and gorgeously written, but ultimately ineffective because it solves the problem, quote unquote, to Harvard's satisfaction, doesn't really reveal anything meaningful about the candidate. On the other hand, you can have a piece of writing that is kind of a big, fat, hairy mess. It's all over the board, structured strangely, quirky. Maybe the grammar, the language, the punctuation aren't exactly what you would expect. Perhaps the candidate has a non traditional learning background in that area. But whatever's in that content rings so true. There's no doubt in anybody's mind this is the person who's writing this essay, and the things that they're writing about are of utmost paramount importance to them. That essay works. So you can have a beautifully written essay that fails and a problematically structured essay that succeeds. It really depends on the content, not on the structure, in my opinion.
And that brings me, to the title. So we were thinking of the dirty approach. So what, according to you, is the clean approach, and how is the dirty approach different?
Uh, I'm not sure what the clean approach is. The dirty approach, I want to append it. I understand that the phrase the dirty approach has some meaning in popular language. But when I think of the dirty approach, I'm actually thinking of the quick and dirty approach, where quick and dirty is another way of saying fast iteration. Write your ideas as quickly as you can, get them out of your brain where you can't really look at them, and get them onto the page where you can start to think about them and operate them on effectively. In support of this, I can think of a couple of strategies. Here's one: tell, don't sell. Your job is never to sell yourself to the schools. Your job is always to self-reveal. So if you have this controlling idea, tell, don't sell, top of mind, then your quick and dirty results will automatically be better because they're more appropriately targeted. Here's another one that I favor: write it long and write it wrong. I think I mentioned this one. If you know the essay is going to need to be 500 words in the end, I recommend targeting 20 to 25% above what you're ultimately going to need, say 600, 650 words, and shoot for that target. If you hit that target, you will know for sure that you're operating at more or less the right level of detail. Whereas if it's a 500-word essay, you have 1,000 words, you have way too much detail. If it's a 500-word essay and you only have 250 words, you're undercooked and you know it. But writing a little bit longer than you ultimately need, that's going to situate you comfortably in the length of an essay that's about the right length and ready for further work. And then the third quick and dirty I'll give you just off the top of my head is mine it and then refine it. A lot of people get hung up because they're trying to get the raw material out of their brain and onto the page and polished and edited all at the same time. My experience as a writer and a teacher of writers taught me a long time ago, these are two different tasks, mining and refining. If you try to do them at the same time, you won't do either of them particularly well. However, if you simply split them in two and consider the first job just to get the raw material out there in any form, and then the second job to appraise what you have, figure out where it is, figure out where it needs to go, and take steps to close the gaps between where it is and where it needs to go, that will have you operating efficiently in the writing realm. One more point I need to add. We like to operate efficiently because there's so much inefficiency built into the process. Why is there so much inefficiency? Because there's so much fear. The candidates that we work with, you and I, by and large, are not touchy-feely people by nature. I'm making a generalization and I apologize in advance for it. But let's just postulate that we have a candidate who has been building a career in some sort of analytical practice, maybe for 4 or 5 years since they left college. All they've been doing is thinking with the left side of their brain and thinking about things outside of their own experience. Now an essay comes along and says, who are you really? Lift the hood on yourself and self-examine. Self-examining is always hard, even if you're not trying to write about it. Self-examining and writing is hard because writing is hard. And self-examining and writing when you don't have any recent practice of it is extremely hard because you don't have recent practice and you don't know what good writing looks like in this sphere. All of these things can contribute to a very strong sense of fear to start, fear to commit, fear to write challenging self-truths on the page. And all of these can be addressed under the umbrella, let's say, of write it wrong and write it long. Because what that really means is don't be afraid to try stuff out and don't expect to get it right on the first try. That's not the way this process works.
Yeah, that makes sense. You know, you mentioned before that the speaking in the we and the us is not something that you want to see your writers, your applicants do. Is there another mistake that you also do not want to see them do, or is there a mistake that you do want to see them do?
Ooh, I actually have an answer that encompasses both of those things. One of the things that we focus on in our approach to editing here at Max Associates is we always want to put a positive spin on things, not a artificially positive spin, but we want to avoid negative positioning. There's two kinds of negative positioning. One kind of negative positioning looks outward, critical of other people, other things. The problem with that is if you're critical of other people, readers tend to be critical of you. Like, oh, it sounds like you're a bad mouther. But the more devious form of negative positioning is negative self-reflection. Let's say we have a candidate who had one semester of really bad grades and they were writing about that and explaining the context for it. It's very easy to fall into the trap of saying, that was a mistake. I shouldn't have done it. It was bad. I'm ashamed of myself. I wish it hadn't happened. All of these things that amount to negative value judgment. Sometimes you have to write your way through the negative value judgment in order to find the truth of what you're really trying to write about. In this case, the truth might be, I underestimated how hard this was going to be, or I overestimated how much time I could devote to extracurricular activities. I got myself into a challenging situation. So now instead of expressing it as that was bad and wrong, and I'm sorry I did it, we're in the more emotionally neutral space, the objective space of this is the experience I encountered. These were the challenges I faced. And this is how I met those challenges. And this is how I adapted and changed as I moved past those challenges and sought and achieved academic excellence from that point forward. We don't want the negative positioning in the final draft, but we're quite okay with negative positioning in the first draft because it might be that the only way the candidate can really express themselves, express that hard truth in initial stages, is just by accepting the negative self-judgment that comes along with it. So if you're working with Max Associates, you're going to hear us say two things that will sound kind of contradictory. One is avoid negative value judgments all the time. And the other is don't be afraid of negative value judgments in first drafts. Seems self-contradictory, but the fuller explanation is, as I've said, sometimes you got to go negative just to figure out what you're talking about. It's a hard circumstance, challenging to write about. Let it be challenging. But also understand that in this case, you are in partnership with a consulting firm that will protect you from negative positioning. That is to say, whatever negative positioning you explore in early drafts, you can be quite certain that none of that negative positioning will make it through to the final draft because your partners, your collaborators in the enterprise will keep their eye on that and make sure that that language doesn't leak through. This is a really sophisticated and multi-leveled and multi-step approach to essay development. And I'm going to say that it requires a certain characteristic of mind. Some candidates simply cannot embrace the idea that writing these essays is a step-by-step process which requires different things and allows different things at different steps. Further to that, and this is something that I love to talk about with candidates, we understand that attending business school is intended to be a transformational experience. Everybody gets that. You go to business school to be transformed. But what's often overlooked is this key idea that the act of applying to business school itself is intended to be transformational. In other words, if you do your job right as a candidate, you'll have a different sense of self coming out of the application process than you had going in. So now if I'm having an initial meeting with a client and I say to them, if you're doing your job right, you're going to be transformed. There are two classes of candidates. Some candidates will say, yay, transformation, bring it on. And other candidates will say, I don't even know what that is, but it scares me to death. No, this isn't the path I want to follow. I just want instructions that I can follow to get a solution that other people tell me is the correct solution. As you can imagine, clients who collaborate with Max Associates, the former do much better with us than the latter, because we really do demand that candidates take themselves on this journey of transformation.
And what I just love about it is, exactly that the whole MBA application process in itself is a tool, and a set of tools rather, for someone to be more self-aware, which is absolutely crucial for a leader later on. So the leadership transformation begins right from the process, and what I like about this process is that it's uncomfortable, and you're just actually sinking into the discomfort till the time it becomes more comfortable, and that's what happens. And then at the end of the, when the essays come out and everything, and when the interviews happen, people are able to be this confident, when we use transformation from the caterpillar to the butterfly kind of a thing, they're able to like bloom into the confidence that happens, right? So yeah, totally reckon what you say about the quick and dirty way of approaching essays now.
Yeah, it turns out the quick and dirty isn't quite as quick and dirty as we think it is. Um, but on the other hand, kind of liberating, because if you go into it with the attitude that nothing matters until the final draft, then you have much more freedom to take chances in the essay spaces that you might. Hey, can I give you another quick and dirty just while I'm thinking about it? This is another concept that I draw on from other parts of my process. Give yourself alternatives. A lot of people will take both big essays and small answer spaces and try to solve it one time only. And my experience of this is from writing jokes. If you have one joke, you might think it's a good joke. You might think it's a bad joke. You might be right. You might be wrong. But one thing you don't know is it the best joke among the jokes you have available to you? On the other hand, if you write even two jokes, you'll know that one is better than the other. And if you write three or four, then the one that emerges as the strongest, the quote unquote best joke, starts to look like something you can trust because you've measured it against contenders. So if I'm apprehending an essay like Stanford, What Matters Most to You and Why, I might dig a couple or three different test wells into that. Hey, what matters most to me is X because of these things here. All right, that seems to be true. But what if it's not true? What if what matters most to me is this other thing Y over here? Let me explore that. And then Z. Now all of a sudden I've got three different answers to the same question. What matters most? And I can look at them and I can see what they have in common. And I can see which one looks like the strongest platform for further development. And as I step through the process, I can have more and more confidence that the choices that I'm making are solid choices, not because they're objectively great choices, they might be, but because they are subjectively or relativistically tested against other candidates for the same spot.
I guess so. John, like, how do you think the importance of the MBA essays are in the application process, and how are they going to change with the AI coming in?
I'm sorry, what exactly are you asking me?
Like, how important do you think these MBA essays are in the whole application process, and how do you think they're going to change with the AI coming in? The importance of the essays.
I place the essays. This is me personally, not official Max Associates policy or MBA truth, objective truth. I place career vision as of utmost importance because I apprehend that the schools are asking themselves, is this candidate's vision sufficiently clear and powerful enough that we A, can understand it, and B, can support it with our learning resources. So the essays that speak to career vision are important. The essays themselves as a class, I rate as second below career vision in rank of importance, simply because the essays, that's where the truth of the candidate is revealed. And the schools want to know, is the person in this application the same as the person behind the application? In other words, am I seeing authentic self-awareness and self-expression? To the question of AI, we can postulate a world in the not too distant future where an artificially intelligence generated essay will look indistinguishable from an authentic human developed essay. We are not yet living in that time. And a lot of people's thoughts about AI don't get beyond, oh, I tried to have it write a joke and it did a terrible job. It's never going to get good. Well, it's going to get good. It's generative learning, and generative learning is designed to improve itself. So whatever limitations we see in generative language models now, we can certainly imagine that those limitations are going to get less and less as time goes by. When the day comes that no human reader or machine reader can detect the difference between a human written essay and a machine written essay, then I think that's the time when the schools will have to ask themselves, what can we do, or what do we need to do in order to take AI out of the mix? One thing I think we can postulate is the idea of a pop-up essay challenge. You know that schools like Kellogg have video essays, and the way they structure their video essays, you kind of don't know what you're going to have to answer until the camera light goes on. They throw a question at you and you have to answer it now. And it's a good way of testing whether that candidate has fundamental understanding of important parts of their application and can speak to those in the moment. Let us imagine that at a certain point in the application process, the schools will say, we've received your application. Now we'd like you to go to this portal here and read the pop-up question and answer it in real time. And down here at the bottom, just tick this box that says you're not incorporating AI into your work. That essay is going to look very quick and dirty. It will have been written in real time. And the pressure of writing it under a deadline extemporaneously in the moment, that's going to challenge writers in different ways than they're challenged now. But it certainly is a way that you can create a viable essay writing challenge that minimizes the impact of AI happening behind the scenes. I use this strategy when I'm onboarding situation comedy writers, if you can believe that. Part of my work is to go into countries where they don't have sitcom and teach and train writers to write this thing. The writers that I recruit are given a set of prompts. I'll take 3 words at random: telephone, brick, blue, and say, write a comedy scene involving those words and send it in within 24 hours. I don't care what the words actually look like. I'm just seeing who can assign themselves the task and execute on the task, get the job done. Because those are writers who are alive in their mind. Writers who send me something they wrote 10 years ago in college, I can't use them. So I do look for strategies that will give me more accurate assessment of the things that I wish to assess. And I can certainly imagine the schools taking that idea on board and evolving their applications in response to evolution in generative machine language learning. Full stop.
John, you speaking about that, and speaking about using AI, ChatGPT, and so forth for writing essays makes me think about you spoke about video essays as well, and how deepfakes are advancing to the point where we cannot tell the difference between a deepfake and part of me almost wants to say, if you're that motivated and that clever to pull the wool over the eyes of like the Harvard MBA admissions team, then maybe you do deserve to get in. But I mean, the technology is coming at a faster and faster pace. I've heard some statistic like by 2026, that's like less than 3 years away. Like that 90% of the content we see online is going to be AI generated. 90%. That's insane.
Wow.
So what do we do about that?
Well, we don't
yesterday, last month when we were at the AIGAC conference, several schools, you all heard, all three of you heard this, several schools got up there and said, hey, you've heard it from us now. We support the use of artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, and so forth in writing your essays. But there's a way to go about it, that it's kind of, you use this as a tool and not as the final product. It is a way to accelerate the process of ideation, creation, but this is not what you submit. Recently on the World Economic Forum, I heard that 20-something schools in the UK have signed an agreement that they are about, being a proponent of it, not being, fear-based thinking that is just like, no, banning it and so forth, but actually teaching their students and teaching the ethics that go along with using it properly and democratizing it so people with a variety of different incomes can access the same tools and use them in their studies and hopefully beyond. So I think those are some key things. Keep the right approach, because it's coming whether we like it or not. So yeah, what does this mean for all of us as admissions consultants is another question.
I have heard it said that artificial intelligence can be used as a competitor, a tool, or I forgot my own quote. There's a lot of hysterical fear around AI, and a lot of it is justified. But there's a lot of hysterical fear around AI that's not quite justified. There is an appropriate use of it as a tool. There is a threat that it will replace certain jobs and certain functions. And these are things that all, we need to consider. When the internet first came out in the mid-90s, a lot of people said, well, that's the end of high school essay writing because everybody can get their essays online now. They never have to write anything themselves. But there was a counter to that. Plagiarism software started to reveal whether content from the internet was finding its way into one's work with consequences. AI is a descendant of that, but a much more powerful one. I don't know if you know this, but one of the key issues in the Actors Guild, the Screen Actors Guild strike, is of really fascinating but paramount importance. The actors are concerned, and rightly, that at this point the technology is such that someone can capture their image, their likeness, their vocal qualities, and recreate it endlessly and manipulate it endlessly, so that we can say, once you've paid an actor and captured their voice and likeness, you never have to pay them again. The Screen Actors Guild regards this as an existential threat to their business model, and they're not wrong. On the other hand,
it is exactly that. A friend of mine who's an actor in LA was telling me just that apparently a lot of these background actors have signed a contract with, tens of thousands or pages of text, basically, not reading all the fine print. And it's in there that they've signed their face away for the rest of their life.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And, mistakes will be made. But guys, you remember the day Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press? It was,
I remember.
Maybe you don't know. I'm a little older than you. In the early 16th century, printed books became possible for the first time. And the first book to be printed and widely distributed was the Bible. And for the first time since the Bible was first written, it was suddenly broadly available in all languages that everybody could read. The consequence of this was the end of the hegemony of the Catholic Church and the rise of the Protestant movement. This idea that you no longer have to have a relationship with God through the intermediary of the priest, who's the only one in the community who really knows what's in the Bible. Instead, you can have your own relationship with God based on your own understanding of the Bible, thanks to the invention of the printing press and the translation of the gospel into a language you can read. That changed the world. It didn't destroy the world. It changed the world for better and for worse in countless respects. If AI ends up having an impact as big as the printing press, it will change the world in major ways, both positive and negative. Here's a positive one that I think is overlooked. You guys have candidates who have translation problems. They don't necessarily operate as well in one language as they do in another. We're rapidly moving toward a world where language barriers are a thing of the past. Any language you have, any language you encounter in someone else's tongue, you can have a flawless, accurate version of it in your own tongue in an instant. That's the promise of AI. Not quite there yet, but very close to there. So we can postulate that the next version of human life on Earth will be one that is not burdened or cursed by the Tower of Babel. We can imagine a world where everybody speaks the same language, even if they don't speak the same language. And the consequence of this, where suddenly everybody realizes, when I read what other people are thinking in my own language, I understand they're thinking the same stuff I'm thinking. I didn't realize that before. Hey, maybe somebody on the other side of the world is connected to me in a fundamental sense that I hadn't embraced up till now. So perhaps there is hope for the future in smashing the language barrier once and for all. As an example of something that AI can do that wouldn't be terrible for everybody.
John, I'm wondering if you knew if back then, if Oxford was offering GMAT waivers to all those town criers that got laid off after that Gutenberg press came out.
Oh, the poor town criers.
Hear ye, hear ye.
Hear ye, hear ye. Sorry,
Damn
that business model is dead. Oh, and Babylonian scribes. That's another lost position of privilege. In ancient Babylonia, the language was called cuneiform, and it didn't have an alphabet. It only had symbols, and the only ones who could read it and write it were trained professional scribes. Along came the Phoenicians on the coast of the Mediterranean. They wanted to trade all over the Mediterranean, and they needed a language that was more flexible, that could be read by people, in Spain versus Lebanon, whatever. So they invented this thing called the Phoenician alphabet, which did a great job of like you could write a bill of lading now and send it with your goods, and people at the other end could know what was in it, but it put every Babylonian scribe right out of work. So it's going to be a threat to somebody. You're either going to adapt, or you're going to get out of that business, or you're going to suffer. I think a lot of it has to do with what you, on an individual basis, are willing to think about and accept in terms of a changing world. But isn't that always the case? If you're adaptive, you adapt. If you're non-adaptive, you perish.
John, could you share a story maybe about your favorite applicant when it comes to essays? Digging deep into the past, maybe not
yes,
the 15th century, but like
not from something more current than that. I'm a fan of the NYU Stern essay Pick Six. I don't know if you know this one. I'm sure you know it. The audience might not. Stern challenges the applicant to come up with 6 images that tell their story, and the constraints are very tight. You must have 6 images. You must have 1 or 2 sentences describing yourself in totality, and then no more than 1 sentence as a caption for each of those images. There are a lot of conventional ways to solve this problem, and there are some unconventional ones. And right now I'm thinking about a candidate who had an interest in fashion and wanted to use MBA Stern as a springboard to their work in the fashion industry. And what they did was they created a paper doll version of themselves, and then created a half a dozen different paper doll outfits in visual form using Photoshop, Illustrator, tools like that, and presented themselves to Stern as 6 differently dressed versions of themselves, with each different version demonstrating a different characteristic of their personality or background and whatnot. And from the moment this candidate pitched me this idea, I was just charmed by it. I said, if you can execute on that, it's going to be a stone cold winner, because it's so authentic to who you are and so relevant to your goals and so imaginative inside an essay space where one of the things you're promoting is using your imagination as a business tool. It ends up being a metalogue. Metalogue is a form of dialogue in which the subject of the dialogue and the structure of the dialogue are the same thing. So this I want to redress the world, and I'm going to demonstrate it by redressing myself. That's a very elegant metalog solution to the pick six problem. It's worth noting that another different candidate could come up with the exact same idea and it wouldn't work because it didn't have that authentic connection either to the candidate's real sense of self or to the candidate's career aspiration. Could be just wrong. So we can see someone maybe reading a book on 100 best pick six solutions for NYU Stern and coming to absolutely the wrong conclusion that picking any one of these 100 winners is going to work for them because it clearly worked for somebody in the past. So what I
Thank
like,
God, John. You
I'm
just
sorry.
saved. Thank God, you just saved NYU Stern from getting more paper dolls.
I'm sure they see it, and probably you guys can speak to this more authoritatively than I can. But stuff comes in trends, doesn't it? I mean, right now our candidates are uh, the COVID impact on all of our candidates is now a couple of 3 years in the past. They're starting to get some perspective on it, and as a class, they're starting to think about how did COVID affect me at critical times. So if I'm admissions this year, I'm expecting to see a lot of COVID related thought and introspection because COVID is such an inflection point, a pivotal moment for so many people in our candidate class this year, next year, year after next. That doesn't mean that it's wrong to talk about COVID just because everybody else is talking about it. It means if it's on your mind, you're going to think about it and write about it in a way that's right for you. If the same idea is on somebody else's mind, they're going to think and write about it in a way that's right for them. I often hear candidates say, as I imagine you do, I'm afraid my story is typical. There's nothing extraordinary about it. It feels so cliche. I don't want to talk about it because it's too normal or too boring or too common. And my response to that is if what you're writing is true to you, it's authentically about you, it's never going to be cliche and it's never going to be repetitive to other people's work. How can it be? The only person who can write authentically about your experience is you. And the only people who can write about other people's experiences authentically, them. So there's a fear of overlap and a fear of appearing quote unquote unoriginal. But that fear is largely based on the untested assumption that if somebody else is talking about it, I shouldn't talk about it at all.
I think when it comes to COVID, it's also that collectively we haven't had a whole community wide experience, a big, acknowledgement in any way that we've all gone through something. And so we don't know what everyone else has gone through.
Mm-hmm.
Some people it's been just horrific. Other people, they were just on retreat. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So we just don't know because there's just been no collective. I remember after 9/11, there was a collective grieving period. And, every corner and on all of the steps in New York, people put up candles and there was a collective experience throughout the entire city. I can't speak to the country. We haven't had that with COVID, in my experience. So
And possibly because while we were in COVID, we were denied collective experience in some. And so coming out of COVID, we didn't necessarily have practice in making COVID a collective
mhm,
experience. We weren't allowed to while it was happening. But
right.
going back to candidates, thinking about COVID as an example, my personal experience of COVID is not uncommon. That when COVID first happened, I felt completely out of control. The world was doing things that I couldn't keep it from doing. And I had a very strong urge to control something that I could control. And that manifested in doing a lot more art, a lot more creativity. I wanted a loud, strong, creative response to what COVID was keeping me from. This was very common. People all over the world responded to COVID by energizing their creative practice. So if I'm a candidate writing about COVID, and as I reflect upon it, what I remember is My God, in the first days of COVID, I set out to write a novel. I never even finished it, but I really got a lot out of the experience. That's what I want to write about. That's the kind of idea that I would probably validate and say, yeah, go with it. Because if you can get down into the realm of feelings, what you felt and why you did what you did, and then you present that essay to an admissions officer, you're taking your ideas across a gulf of experience, from your experience to their experience. They might very well have had that same sensation. They might very well have written their own half novel or poetry or taken up art or drawing, something like that. And there will be a resonance, a human connection between the writer of that essay and the reader of that essay that will tell the reader of that essay that the writer knows what's going on.
All right, so John, one last thing. What is, before we wrap up here, what is one tip that you want people to know about tackling their MBA essays before we say goodbye today?
Lower your expectations. At the end of the day, you're going to do a great job. The thing that will keep you from starting and working effectively is the fear of not doing a great job. If you set your goal, do your best and have fun, that will help you do a great job in every execution step of the application, from thinking about your career vision, executing the biographical sections, doing the essays, doing the interview, all of it. Do your best and have fun.
Can't argue with you there. Can't argue with you there, John. Thanks.
Well, that is all the time that we have for the episode today. The only thing we didn't talk about in terms of essays, I think, was Barbie and Oppenheimer. So we didn't get to those topics.
Oppenheimer.
But I do want to thank our featured guest, John Vorhaus from Max Associates. It was great to have you. And I want to thank all of our guests in the audience. It was a pleasure to hear from you, John, and from my colleagues in this very wide-ranging topic of conversation. And I love how we got, it comes down to being authentic. I think the takeaway word is authentic here. So MBA hopefuls, if you like today's episode, please give us a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe to MBA Waves to stay on top of all the latest trends and the news in the world of MBA's business and education. And finally, don't forget to check us out next week, the same time, the same place. And for full access of upcoming and previous episodes, please head to MBA.com. Bye, everyone. Have a great week.